Good morning, students. Welcome to the second part of Chapter 2, The End of Bipolarity. In the last session, we talked about the creation of USSR, fall of Berlin Wall on 9th November 1989. Then we referred to the features of Soviet Union that included setting up a society based on socialist principles, equality, abolition of private property, among others, followed by the causes of disintegration of USSR. Today, we will start the session by talking about consequences of disintegration, shock therapy in post-communist regimes, consequences of shock therapy, and India's relations with post-communist countries, mainly with Russia, as it was the successor of USSR. This means that Russia took over the permanent member's seat of USSR in the United Nations Security Council. Let's start with consequences of disintegration. The collapse of Second World of the Soviet Union and the socialist systems in Eastern Europe had profound consequences for world politics. There are three major kinds of consequences that further had number of effects. First and the foremost is the end of Cold War confrontations. This also meant things like, first, end to ideological dispute, and end to arms race that triggered during the Cold War. Secondly, power relations in world politics changed. The end of Cold War left open only two possibilities. Either the remaining superpower would dominate and create a unipolar system, or different countries or groups of countries could become important players in international systems, thereby bringing in a multipolar system where no one power could dominate. Institutions like the World Bank and the IMF became powerful advisors to all these created countries. Politically, the notion of liberal democracy emerged as the best way to organize political life. Thirdly, emergence of new countries was the end result of the disintegration. All these countries had their own independent aspirations and choices. Some of them, especially the Baltic and East European states, wanted to join the European Union and become part of North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now let's go to the next topic, that is shock therapy. This is not the one given in hospitals, but yes, it has one thing in common. That is, it's a painful process. In politics, shock therapy refers to a process of sudden transition. In this case, a sudden transition from an authoritarian socialist system to a democratic capitalist system. It was influenced by World Bank and IMF. Let us talk about its features. Each of these countries was required to make a total shift to a capitalist economy, which meant rooting out completely any structures evolved during the Soviet period. Privatization of state assets and corporate ownership patterns were to be immediately brought in. Collective farms were to be replaced by private farming. This transition ruled out any alternate way other than the state-controlled socialism or capitalism. Let us talk about the foreign relations. Shock therapy also involved a drastic change in external orientation of these economies. The free trade regime and foreign direct investment were to be the main engines of the change. The Western capitalist states now became the leaders and thus guided and controlled the development of the region through various agencies. Let's move on to the next topic, which is consequences of shock therapy. There are three categories of consequences, that is, economic, political, and geographical. First, let's talk about economic consequences. The promises of mass consumption remained only in words. In Russia, the large state-controlled industrial complex almost collapsed. The restructuring was carried out through market forces and not by the government-directed industrial policies. You know what this meant? Almost disappearance of entire industries. This was called the largest garage sale, as valuable industries were undervalued and sold at throwaway prices. The value of their currency declined. Rate of inflation was so high that people lost all their savings. Also, the collective farm system disintegrated, leaving people without food security, and Russia had to actually import food. The old system of social welfare was clearly destroyed. The middle classes were pushed to the periphery of society. A mafia emerged in most of these countries and started controlling many economic activities. This resulted in large economic disparities in the society. Moving further to political consequences. The construction of democratic institutions was not given the same attention and priority as the demands of economic transformation. In Central Asia, the presidents had great powers and several of them became very authoritarian. And you know what? They appointed themselves to power for life. They allowed no dissent or opposition. A judicial culture and independence of judiciary was yet to be established in most of these countries. Going further to geographical reasons, the reason for the revival for most of their economies after disintegration was the export of natural resources like oil, natural gas, and minerals. On the other hand, other countries have gained because of the oil pipelines that cross their territories for which they get the rent. Let's move ahead and talk about Soviet republics created after disintegration. Most republics could not cope up with this transition. Some faced civil wars like Tajikistan and Yugoslavia, whereas others witnessed conflicts over river waters. In Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia split peacefully into two, with the Czechs and the Slovaks forming independent countries. Can you guess what was the political impact of all this? Yes, it led to instability, making life difficult for people. Not to miss, the situation became complicated with also the influence of foreign powers like USA and China. India's relations with Russia are an important aspect of India's foreign policy. Indian heroes from Raj Kapoor to Amitabh Bachchan and even to Shah Rukh Khan are household names in Russia and many post-Soviet countries. Russia and India share a vision of a multipolar world order, which is the coexistence of several powers in the international system, collective security, negotiated settlements of international conflicts, and decision making through bodies like the United Nations, that should be strengthened. India stands to benefit from its relationship with Russia on issues like Kashmir, energy supplies, sharing information on international terrorism, and many more. The Indian military gets most of its hardware from Russia. Russia is important to India and has repeatedly come to the assistance of India during its oil crisis. India is seeking to increase its energy imports from Russia and republics of Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Russia is important for India's nuclear energy plans and assisted India's space industry by giving the cryogenic rocket when India needed it. This is it for the day. But before leaving, let us revise what we have done in this session. First, we talked about consequences of disintegration that were categorized under three headings: end of Cold War, unipolar or multipolar world, and emergence of new countries. Then we move to the shock therapy. It is a system of transition in Russia, Central Asia, and East European nations influenced by World Bank and IMF. Then we discussed the consequences of shock therapy. That includes Laches Garat sale, the constitutions were drafted in a hurry, and the rulers became authoritarian. Lastly, we talked about the importance of India and Russia relations in the present times. Its assistance to India during the oil crisis is commendable. India is the second largest arms market for Russia. With this, I end the session today. Meet you in the next one. Thank you.